Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. Together, we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. How you doing, Bettina?
I'm doing great, Alan. I'm excited that we're starting this podcast. I'm thinking our listeners need to know who we are and why we're here. So, Alan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Who are you and what makes you qualified to talk to us about religious freedom?
Well, when I was of college age, I had a religious awakening as a Christian. I'm from a Jewish home. And as a Seventh-day Adventist, now I'm a member of not one, but two religious minorities. And I very quickly gravitated and felt called by God to work in the area of religious freedom. And that's been my life's work for decades, serving as a minister and a lawyer within the Seventh-day Adventist context. How about you? How did you come to be editor of the nation's oldest, and I've often said very best, publication devoted to religious freedom, Liberty Magazine?
Well, I don't know if you've noticed, Alan, but I have an accent. Did you pick that up?
Yes, I've noticed.
So I am Australian originally, and almost 25 years ago, I graduated law school in Australia and arrived on these fair shores. And my very first job was with an advocacy organization called Council on Religious Freedom. I don't know if you remember it.
I do.
You do?
And I remember when you came to it.
Oh, right. So the very first piece of legislation I was involved with was the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act way back in the early 2000s. So that was my introduction to religious freedom in America. And I tell you, it's a topic that has just taken me and grabbed my attention ever since. This is what I have really devoted my work to since that time. And yes, at the moment, I am editor of Liberty Magazine.
So, but Tina, at the opening, I said something about trying to recover religious freedom from the extremes. And, it makes me think of kind of all those recovery programs for all of our messed up people who need help, right? But religious freedom needs help too, doesn't it? What's the problem with the extremes these days? How does that, why is it religious freedom needs recovery?
Yeah, we need a 12-step program. We do. So, Alan, I said I came to Washington back in the early 2000s. And when we sat down to talk about advocacy on religious freedom, sitting around that table were not just religious organizations, conservative religious organizations, but also more what you would consider liberal advocacy organizations like the ACLU, for instance, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Many, it was a diverse group. And we were all brought together by this single idea that religious freedom was a fundamental human right. It was enshrined in our Constitution, and it deserved protection. And we needed to advocate for a strong, robust protection for religious freedom in society. I don't know if you've read any headlines lately, Alan, but nothing could be further from the truth in terms of how religious freedom is perceived in American society, right?
No, I think that's true. Certainly, the left sees religious freedom as being hijacked in favor of Christian religious privilege, and has become increasingly in some of my secular friends are increasingly hostile to the whole idea of religion as a result, which is a huge problem. And of course, the rhetoric on the right is about religion being marginalized in society and the threat of, what would be described as the loony left, right?
Oh, absolutely. And you hear this rhetoric of religious freedom should be a shield, not a sword. and that's coming from the left. And the implication is that religious freedom is increasingly being used by conservative Christian folk as a means to harm others, to push back on the rights of others, to step over the line. Um, and and it's been perceived as sort of a selfish pursuit rather than a pursuit of something that applies to everyone, regardless of what their faith is or whether they have no faith at all. And, it's just hard to know how to retrieve that sort of extreme rhetoric.
Well, and with some truth to it, to be sure. On the right, the wall of separation between church and state is increasingly seen as a wall that is pushing the church back outside of public life and back inside the walls of the sanctuary, so that as soon as you step out of the church, you've lost your religious freedom.
And that narrative, the lack of rationality, I guess, of the narrative, I mean, both sides are to blame. I mean, I wrote an editorial recently called The Madness of Crowds. And really, the idea of religious freedom has been hijacked by this irrational groupthink from both sides. So whenever a religious freedom claim is articulated, then immediately it gets filtered through these two extreme political lenses. And I think that's the challenge that we, as advocates for religious freedom, but also advocates for a strong, robust church state separation as part of that religious freedom, that's a challenge we face. How do you navigate that middle path of understanding what religious freedom is?
Well, we're going to have to try to find out and ask our guests. And I think the first shows we're going to really try to explore why liberty matters to some of those who are leading advocates of religious freedom.
Yeah. And I'm excited about our first guest, which is Amanda Tyler. So why don't we bring her on? Amanda Tyler, who is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which is one of the foremost and oldest advocacy organizations on public policy issues in the nation's capital. You've been around a long time, Amanda.
We have. I'm delighted to be here, Bettina. BJC is in its 87th year of advocating for faith freedom for all.
And that really gets to the point of this conversation. I mean, you have seen the landscape around religious freedom just change dramatically through the decades. I mean, back 1990s, there was a lot of bipartisanship around the issue of religious liberty. It seems to have fractured somewhat. I mean, what are you seeing as the biggest challenges for religious liberty today in America?
Yeah, I think it is incredibly disheartening to see the politicization of religious freedom and some of these ideals that are really bedrock to American democracy and to our constitutional system. This idea that belonging in American society should never depend on what we believe or how we worship or how we identify religiously. And, you point to the 1990s, and I certainly think that these last 3 decades, we have seen erosion of, unanimity or understanding about what some of these core principles mean. And I point to a resurgence of Christian nationalism, this ideology that tries to merge American and Christian identities and really a particular kind of Christianity as one of the reasons that we've seen a breakdown over agreement over religious freedom.
Let me ask this as a follow-up, Amanda. You mentioned Christian nationalism, and Bettina, and we all know what we mean by that, but I'm not at all sure that our listeners really know what that is and why it's significant. Uh, Certainly, we have a lot of Christians who would be expected to be our listening audience, and of course, we are all Americans, and we all love our country. There's nothing wrong with that. But what exactly do you mean by Christian nationalism?
Well, I think that's an excellent place to start, and it's usually where I start because I think it's really important that we have a common understanding and vocabulary, particularly when we talk about a very difficult issue like Christian nationalism. So, the definition I would provide is Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a true American, to be a full American, one has to be Christian, and really a particular type of Christian that holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political positions. And this ideology relies heavily on the mythology of the founding of the country as a Christian nation. That is one founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. And this mythology is at odds with the history of the founding of the country, where the founders made a very deliberate break with the practice of established religion at the time in favor of a constitution that would protect everyone's religious liberty by saying that the government does not have a role in matters of religion. And that understanding is in the Constitution in Article 6 and its prohibition against religious tests for public office, and also in the First Amendment to the Constitution, saying that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So these constitutional protections for religious freedom cut against this false myth of the country as a Christian nation. Now, it is true that a majority of Americans throughout our history have claimed a Christian identity. And so I think there is this tension that's always there, where there might be a tendency to try to claim power and privilege based on our religion, and then these constitutional legal protections that protect minority religious views, so that we are all equal citizens without regard to religion. So that's the large frame that I would, in the language that I would set as we talk about Christian nationalism.
So I'm interested, Amanda, that you immediately jumped to that as the biggest challenge facing liberty today in America. Give our listeners, I guess, more of a tangible, a concrete understanding of how resurgent Christian nationalism is going to change or has changed religious liberty. Give us more concrete examples of where you see that happening.
Well, I'll look into our somewhat recent past, to one of the first policies that then President Trump tried to put in place, and that was a Muslim ban. One of the very first policies that he put into place, and it was carrying out a campaign promise that he made while on the trail. And so this was, I think, very much a policy that it was in line with Christian nationalism, this signal that to be truly American, to belong here, one has to be Christian, and specifically that one can't be Muslim, right? That there is something suspect about being another religious faith, and that we would base our immigration policy on religion. And this undercuts these values of religious freedom for all. So that's one example of a policy that I think is rooted in Christian nationalism and how that impacts religious freedom for everyone. We've also seen in a very, I think, a threatening way how religious freedom has been threatened in houses of worship when we've had violent white supremacists, who have been in part inspired by Christian nationalism, who went into houses of worship. I'm thinking about Tree of Life Synagogue in particular, as well as Mother Emanuel AME Church, and killed people while they were worshiping. This is a very big direct attack on religious freedom, and one that's fueled by Christian nationalism. But we also have much more everyday examples, and I think specifically about some of the policies that state legislatures are pursuing in the public school context, policies that are influenced by Christian nationalism that would, for instance, require the posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools, or as the Texas legislature considered this past legislative session, a bill that did not passed, but that would require the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. Again, these are bills that are furthered by groups that have a Christian nationalist agenda, that send the signal that full belonging is reserved for those who claim a Christian identity or a particular religious background, and that ideology is going to be pursued through policies that are directed at public schools. Those are all examples.
We're going to have to take a look at some of these specific examples in future shows because they deserve a lot more time. The Ten Commandments posting bill did not pass, but another one did, which was requiring chaplains in public schools. And that's a head scratcher for me. This is the Texas chaplain bill because I've, I've trained chaplains here in California, prison chaplains, and lectured to them years ago, we had that bill in Congress protecting religious freedom for people who are incarcerated. And I'm struggling to understand how there can be a legitimate role for a chaplain in a public school. But, we'll get into that, I'm sure, in another time. If you want to, speak to that, by all means.
Yeah, no, that particular policy is definitely front of mind for me now, because I have recently become a Texas resident. And so we are working to do some organizing here in Texas, because even though that law passed, it is now up to each school district in the state of Texas, more than 1,100 of them, to determine whether or not they will indeed have a school chaplain policy in their school district. And so I think it is important for those who have experience with chaplaincy, and that is a very important role in certain contexts. It does not belong in the public school context. And so to understand how context matters when it comes to protecting religious freedom, and how, in this case, the Texas legislature has created more problems than they were allegedly trying to solve with this policy, I think it's up to everyone to stand up for religious freedom concerns. And this is, again, one of these bills that was passed by groups and pushed by groups who have a Christian nationalist agenda, who are trying specifically to proselytize in public schools and to do so with this chaplain policy. And that's extremely concerning when it comes to the religious freedom rights of those students and their families, that we all have a right to send our kids to public school without worrying that the state is going to interfere with their religious instruction.
So, Amanda, I'm, as you know, editor of Liberty Magazine, and one of the complaints or one of the concerns that I often hear from readers, especially those who are either religiously or politically conservative, is that religion is being pushed out of the public space, and religion is being, or Christianity specifically, is being marginalized. It's being pushed to the cultural margins. It's under attack, and that's sort of narratives that many American Christians are hearing, not only hearing, but they're embracing. Just to play devil's advocate here, what would you say to the idea that there are strident voices perhaps on the left that are sort of stoking the fears of some on the right that they are being marginalized in some way? Is there a happy medium where religion and Christianity has an acknowledged and open space in society without sort of breaching either of these two extremes?
Yeah, well, as a Baptist Christian, I will say from a personal standpoint, I do not at all feel marginalized in American society. I think it's very difficult from a logical standpoint to think about a majority religion as being marginalized in our society. And I think the wrong impulse is to then ask the government to prop up our religion in any way. That has proven to be the worst way to foster religious freedom around the world throughout history. And so that is the wrong instinct. Instead, I think if we're concerned about the vitality of our religion and our religious practice, we should look to our religious institutions and ask more of them to foster that kind of community and vitality. I to get to that bigger issue of how vital and how vibrant is American Christianity, I think that's a question for our religious institutions, not a question for the government.
What I'm seeing, Amanda, is that the more political the church becomes and the more focused on, you know, enacting these kinds of policies, the more hostile the unchurched become and less receptive to the claims of Christ. Uh, do you see that happening from your point of view?
Well, I do because I think, fundamentally, and this is one of the major problems with Christian nationalism, is how at odds it is with the gospel and the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, who was always on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized, and who was himself a victim of state power. And so there's something very perverse about the way that Christian nationalism tries to use the power of the state for its message. And so I can understand why those who are not only I can understand how Christians can be offended by this, but also how non-Christians can really get turned off by Christianity when we are trying to use the power of the state to force Christianity on others. That is not in line with the message of the gospel, and it is not in line with the democratic values that we hold up as patriotic Americans. And so it is because of my patriotism, as well as because of my Christian faith, that I feel called to push back against Christian nationalism and ultimately to advocate for religious freedom for everyone, not just those who believe the way that I do.
So, Amanda, we've diagnosed a problem pretty clearly. I mean, there is such a political divide on this issue, and it doesn't seem to be that the tone is increasing in pitch, not decreasing. What can we do? Are there concrete steps that we can take as individuals to make the public discussion around this question of religious freedom a little bit more healthy?
Well, I think that we can insist on a better understanding about what religious freedom is and to try to separate religious freedom from religious privilege or from Christian nationalism. As I have developed language and worked with others to develop language around Christian nationalism, I found that often the words religious freedom are actually used for things that are much more akin to Christian nationalism. And so I think we can insist on some specificity when it comes to language. And I would offer as one resource a platform that we at BJC have helped to lead over the last 4 years called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And it's found at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And we have a number of resources there for people to help parse this language and to understand how Christian nationalism is a threat to American democracy and to religious freedom and to a faithful Christian witness. And we also have tools there to help people have conversations with people, whether they be in their religious communities or in their families or in their broader communities, to help find common ground. We don't have to agree on all of our politics, on all of our ideology, on our theology, but we can find common ground in pushing back against Christian nationalism and standing up for religious freedom for all.
Well, I appreciate your gospel-centered approach and your golden, what I would call a golden rule approach, which has been how I explain our work as Seventh-day Adventists. That part of our reputation globally is that we advocate for freedom of faith for all, not just for ourselves. And I think that reflects the character of Christ, frankly. And we're certainly very grateful for the work of BJC. We've been friends and partners for forever, for the 3 decades that I've been involved, and very happy to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. I'm so pleased to have you all as partners, because this will take a broad, diverse coalition if we are going to work to dismantle Christian nationalism and protect religious freedom for all.
And I have to say in closing too, I have said for a long time whenever I've had somebody who's Baptist on my other radio show, uh, Adventists, we stand on Baptist shoulders as a kind of a matter of historical fact. We kind of come by our understanding of separation of church and state and religious freedom, very much influenced by Baptist roots, and we're very, very appreciative of them.
Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic having Amanda Tyler from Baptist Joint Committee as our inaugural guest, wasn't it, Bettina?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Christian nationalism, we don't usually think of that when we're talking about religious freedom, but she's right. It really does impact the way we conceive of what religious liberty means, right?
Well, it does, and I mean, I'm glad we got into the kind of the gospel implications of it, because my biggest concern is how the church has alienated itself from the very ones that we're called to witness for Christ about and to invite to participate in his salvation.
So, Alan, I have a great book recommendation exactly on that point. Just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Andrew Whitehead, and I think you'll know the name. He's a sociologist and author, and he's just released a book called American Idolatry, which is all about how Christian nationalism is really harming the church itself. And, it was what I appreciated about his approach is that he's not taking a scientific approach to it. He's talking to Christians as fellow brothers and sisters in the faith and saying, hey, if you're going to follow Christ, Christian nationalism just gets in the way. And, that's a really, really good read.
So as soon as you said he was a sociologist, I'm imagining that some of our listeners are like, it's probably not a book for me. But is it, and we don't want to read this boring whatever, but is it a readable, is it a really compelling read?
It's totally readable. In fact, in my review for Liberty Magazine, I started off by saying there's a surprising absence of statistics in this book. So so he's taking very much an accessible approach. Yeah, I would recommend people look that up, American Idolatry by Andrew Whitehead.
Well, I wrote it down. I'm looking forward to reading it.
This has been Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Bettina Krause, here with Alan Reinach, and until next week, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.